Hello and welcome friends, I am That Happy Viking and I would like to present to you my set review for Ikoria for Gentry. If you have no idea what Gentry is, check the description below this video for more information. In this episode, we will be looking at the red cards. First up, we have Blazing Volley at 1 mana for a common sorcery. It deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. In the other colors we've already seen, there's more incentive for white to go tokens. The humans deck, the black-white humans deck is probably going to be playable. So that is going to make tokens more viable. If we see that happening to the meta game, Blazing Volley will be a played sideboard card for sure. Blister Spitremlin is a 1 mana common 1/1 creature that you can tap for 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell you untap Blister Spitremlin. This harkens back to some other cards that deal damage to your opponent whenever you cast non-creature spells, but all of the other ones have just been better because you don't need to tap them and they don't require a mana investment. So Blister Spitremlin I don't think is playable. Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is a 2 mana uncommon instant. Deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. We already have Beacon Bolt, which is now being played and is straight up better because you get to cast it twice. Getting the 1 mana discount and instant I don't think is enough to replace that one, and I don't really see this played in a other shell. Cathartic Reunion is a 2 mana sorcery, common sorcery. Reprint as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard 2 cards, then draw 3 cards. It's a huge risk reward thing. And currently we have Thrill of Possibility, that is a 2 mana instant, discard 1 card to draw 2. Which is generally played over this slot because the draw 2 decks don't care about drawing more than 2 cards per turn, and it's less of a risk as well because if they counter this you have lost your 2 cards and you're not drawing anything. Clash of Titans is a 5 mana uncommon instant. Target creature fights another target creature. This allows you to make your opponent's creatures fight with each other. While this, in its best case scenario, is a huge blowout because it's a 2-for-1, usually is a 1-for-1 that leaves the bigger creature on the board and takes up an uncommon slot. Don't play this. Cloud Piercer is a 5 mana 5/4 common dinosaur that mutates for 4. We get the discount. It has a reach, and whenever this creature mutates you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. At first glance this looks underwhelming, but if you start thinking about it, I already mentioned that mutate creatures that have a high base power and toughness are really interesting to stack multiple abilities on. So that upgrades this creature in its playability. That said, red seems to be a less strong mutate color, which really hurts this card. If a red mutate deck does pop up, I do expect people to be playing this for the base power and toughness and the utility of the draw discard. Especially on a common, this offers quite a bit to people. Granite Stinger is a 2 mana common 2/2. Whenever you cycle another card, Granite Stinger deals 1 damage to each opponent. And it has cycling 1 itself. So this is probably the best common cycle aggro enabler we have. This is the card I think that puts this cycling red-white deck into the realm of playability for Gentry. Whether it's going to be enough to compete with the straight-up Boros aggro decks, I'm not sure. But in that deck, you are playing this one. Everquill Phoenix is a 4-mana rare 4/4 flying with mutate 4. So the only discount you get on your mutate is a little bit of a color requirement. Whenever this creature mutates, create a red artifact token named Feather with 1 sacrifice feather, return target Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this counters the disadvantage that mutate gives by guaranteeing you it will come back. And as a 4/4 flying for 4, it's pretty decent already. It is lacking a bit in like board presence for a rare, but the fact that it returns makes it really problematic for your opponent. On the other hand, again, the mutate focused decks are probably not going to be looking at red that much, so I don't think this will find a home. Ferocious Tigerilla is a 4-mana common 4/3 creature that enters the battlefield with trample or menace on it. 4/3 is a good size. 4 power matters decks already exist, but they will be looking at other creatures. You can get 4 power on 3 mana already, and at 4 mana there are just better options. So I don't really see this being played. Fire Prophecy is a 2-mana common instant that deals 3 damage to target creature. You may put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. If you do, draw a card. I think this is an insane card and is a very strong competition for Scorching Dragonfire in the control slot of removal. Currently, the exile clause on Scorching Dragonfire is really important. But as soon as that eases up even just a little bit, I see this card taking over immediately. And I'm not going to be surprised if it does straight away. It's that good. The art is creepy though, so maybe that will deter people. I don't know. Flamespell is a 3-mana uncommon instant that deals 4 damage to target creature. Excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. This looks really nice, right? 3 mana, 4 damage, of which 3 maybe goes to your opponent's face if they have a creature. If they don't have a creature, then this does nothing, which makes it super awkward to be playing this. I totally expect people to be playing this. But it's going to be really awkward, especially with Thorbrands involved, because that just hides damage that you think will go through and doesn't. So I hope it won't be played too much in mono red, because mono red really likes their uncommons right now. But I think people are going to be overly focused on the upside of Flamespell and will be disappointed by its problems. Footfall Crater is a 1-mana uncommon enchant land that has tap, target creature gains trample and haste until end of turn, also cycles for 1. So we have the cycling 1 as a baseline value here. Giving a creature trample and haste is a bit underwhelming. The first one can come as a bit of a surprise, but after that it is just there on the table. So I don't think this effect is good enough to dedicate one of your uncommon slots onto it. Forbidden Friendship is a 2-mana common sorcery that creates a red dinosaur creature token with haste and a white human soldier creature token without haste. This is a really interesting card for the human, non-human decks that have quite a bit of support in red, white, but is also just really interesting in the Cavalcade of Calamity decks that we see now as a 1/1 haste with a body that will do an extra damage next turn. Is it good enough to replace some of the other commons in the deck? I'm not sure, since people were already strained on which 1-drops they wanted to play, but I do think it should be taken in consideration for that deck. Frenzied Raptor is a 3-mana 4/2, and as we mentioned before, there is a deck that wants 4-power creatures, and that might want to look at this one, because if I'm not mistaken, there is no ogre at this point, which is usually the 4-mana, the 3-mana 4/2. Still, even then, a 3-mana 4/2, that's too many numbers in one row, is a awkward card. It puts a lot of pressure on your opponent, but as soon as they have pretty much anything decent to trade with, it's probably going to trade down if you're on the offensive. If you're on the defensive, it's going to trade up. But then again, why are you playing big power creatures on the defensive? A bit awkward for that. Next up we have frillscar Mentor, a 3-mana uncommon 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, put a menace counter on target non-human creature you control. And for 3 mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with menace. This requires a big red deck to exist. If that were to happen, then it could be interesting, but right now there isn't really room for this kind of incrementally growing red deck. So I would be very surprised to see that become a deck. Go for Blood is a 2-mana common sorcery that makes target creature you control fight target creature you don't control. Has that super valuable cycling 1 again, and is again a decent card without a home. This wants mid to large sized creatures to be fighting with smaller creatures. If that big red deck comes to be, this might be playable, but most likely those decks will also be playing green, and at that point we will see there's better tools they have available than this one. Heightened Reflexes is a 1-mana common instant that gives a creature +1/+0 until end of turn and puts a first strike counter on it. We've seen iterations of the combat trick that gives +1/+0 and first strike already, but the fact that this one gives a first strike counter as well could push it over the top. You would need a deck focused on taking advantage of that first strike counter. And again, that probably involves getting bigger red involved. Otherwise, there's just better options for you currently available. Lava Serpent is a 6-mana common 5/5 creature with haste that has cycling 2. It's a decent sized finisher, and yet again we're saying the same thing. This only really slots into a late game oriented big red deck, which currently doesn't exist, and I still don't think it has the tools available to it to really come into fruition in Gentry. Luca, Coppercoat Outcast is a 5-mana mythic planeswalker. It can exile the top 3 cards. Creatures exiled this way gain, you may cast this from exile as long as you control a Luca planeswalker. You can -2 to exile target creature you control, then reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card with higher converted mana cost. Put that onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And then with -7, each creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. Okay, I've said big red a bunch of times, but this is the ultimate big red card. It gives you card advantage, which you're going to need. It gives you a -2 that if you could design your deck correctly will always end up in you finding a particular rare that you've built around. And the -7 is probably game over each time in that deck. So I will be looking at making big red, but I'm still not sure if it has what it takes to be a real deck. Other than that, I don't see a creature-oriented, slow planeswalker really be playable. But if that deck is there, it's going to use Luca, and every time it gets activated, it's going to be insane. Momentum Rumbler is a 4-mana, 3/3 uncommon dinosaur. Whenever it attacks, if it doesn't have first strike, put a first strike counter on it. Whenever it attacks, if it has first strike, it gains double strike until end of turn. I don't think this is good enough unless, and here we go again, you're playing big red, but also with pump spells to really take advantage of that first strike, or some repeatable effect that really boosts that power. It's a really interesting card. It has a really interesting power level, but as 4 mana, it just falls short of where you want a creature to be in your aggro deck, and at 3/3, it just falls short on where you want to be with your big red deck. And your big red deck is going to be really, really crunched on their uncommons, because all those good cards you want to play are uncommons. Mythos of Vodrok. 4 mana, rare sorcery, deals 5 damage, divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers. If white and red was spent to cast this spell until your next turn, those permanents can't attack or block, and their activated abilities can't be activated. Rare or mythic sorceries and instants need to be really good to have that kind of impact on the board. That said, does this have that? Mythos, 4 mana to do 5 damage, but not to the player, I don't think is good enough. The detain on 5 permanents is pretty good, but I don't think, no, this shouldn't get played ever. Porky Parrot is a 4 mana uncommon creature that has mutate 3. And you can also tap it to deal X damage to any target, where X is the number of times this creature has mutated. I don't think this will be played. You need to multi-mutate onto this to get anything relevant pretty much going. Otherwise, there's simply better cards that you can play in red to reach the same outcome. Don't play this, it's not worth your uncommon slot. Red also doesn't have a way to protect a multi-mutated creature, at which point this starts becoming interesting. Like having this on 3 mutations becomes decent, but you know? Prickly Marmoset is a 3 mana 2/3 common creature with first strike. Whenever you cycle a card, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. I think it might be a necessity for the cycling decks, but it is underwhelming. At 1/4, this would have been really good, because then it survives all the marquee common removal spells in red. As is, I think you're gonna need to play it if you want to play cycling, and are going to be very disappointed by it. Saratops is a 4 mana 2/3 trample. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Saratops. We already have a 3 mana 2/2 without trample available with this effect that isn't being played, and there's just better effects for heavy non-creature spell decks to invest into than this. Might appear in sideboards, but I don't think so. Raking Claws is a 2 mana common instant. Target creature gets double strike until end of turn and has cycling. An interesting tool for that big red deck, otherwise largely unplayable. Has cycling though, so it is cycling 2, which makes it slightly better. Reptilian Reflection is a 3 mana enchantment, uncommon. Whenever you cycle a card, you may have it become a 5/4 dinosaur with trample and haste in addition to its other types until end of turn. So on curve, this is a dead card. Later on, well, on curve, it's a creature that doesn't, it's a permanent that doesn't do anything. Later on, it can be a surprise attacker. I think this is a better cycling enabled card. The 4 toughness really puts it over the top. And if you're playing red based cycling, which you probably need to with the 2-drop that pings, if you want to play cycling, this is going to be part of your core. Rooting Moloch is a 5 mana uncommon 4/4 creature. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card with a cycling ability from your graveyard until end of your turn. You may play that card. The fact that it has cycling itself makes it an engine on its own. And that might be interesting for the big red cycling. Maybe that deck has a cycling engine. But other than that, it's interesting card advantage and a good mid-sized body. This might actually get played in the, not the aggro cycling deck, but again, the big red deck that I'm still not sure has the tools to survive in Gentry. Stay tuned. Rumbling Rockslide is a 4 mana common sorcery that deals damage to target creature equal to the number of lands you control. I don't think this will ever get played. There's way better options for red removal than this, and if red wants to go into the late game, it probably is paired with a color that's better at dealing with bigger creatures. And also there's not that many creatures that you want to be killing that are bigger than 5 toughness anyway. Could be maybe a 1 or 2 of in sideboards of that big red deck. I don't know. Sanctuary Smasher is a 6 mana 6/4 first strike that you can cycle to put a first strike counter on target creature you control. Big red, maybe ramp decks might be interested in this, but I don't really see it happening. It's a really problematic card to have on the board though, and at 4 toughness, that's that minimum requirement to be a big creature and protect yourself a little bit. But that's only against red. Against all the other colors, it doesn't really matter. So probably better options available. Shredded Sails is a 2 mana instant that can destroy an artifact or deals 4 damage to target creature with flying and has cycling. This is huge. This card is exactly what mono red wishes they've had up until now. Not exaggerating. Mono red is currently playing what is it? Reckless Airstrike or something like that. That let them destroy an artifact or deal 3 damage to target creature with flying. It doesn't have cycling, but only costs 1 mana. This is 11-7 times better. This lets you kill a Crackling Drake. This lets you kill a flashed in pumped Fairy Vandal that gets a Shattering Insight. This does so much more and does all the same just as well. The fact that it also has cycling, so it's never really a dead card in your hand if you reach that later mid stage. Just this is a 3 to 4 off in every mono white Cavalcade deck's sideboard. Straight up. Spell Eater Wolverine is a common 3 mana 3/2 that has double strike as long as there are 3 or more instants and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. We've seen the uncommon that first gets first strike and then gets double strike. That I already said that that's the type of card that wants extra pump spells to really make it worthwhile, and if that is a deck, this one will probably be one of those filler cards that you want to have along with it. A more pump spell oriented, pump and burn spell oriented mono red or Boros deck might look at this, but probably has better options. I don't think the double strike deck really has what it takes currently to get there, because it invests too heavily in one permanent and probably has a very hard time protecting that permanent. Tentative Connection is a 4 mana common sorcery that costs 3 less if you control a creature with menace. Gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. So this is the Act of Treason Asterix version of this deck. We haven't really seen enough support with menace to make this worthwhile. All those cards are somewhat overcosted. The only one is the one that when it enters the battlefield it puts a menace counter on something and then puts +1/+1 counters on all the creatures with menace as it goes. In that deck, yes, maybe this would be interesting, but it kind of doesn't need this because it's already spreading menace everywhere and making things hard to block. I don't think this will ever or should ever get played. Unpredictable Cyclone is a 5 mana rare enchantment. If a cycling ability of another non-land card would cause you to draw a card, instead exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a card that shares type with the cycled card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then put the exiled cards that weren't cast this way on the bottom of your library in any order. If cycling is a thing, or if cycling is a bit of a part of the late game big red decks, then it will feature this. Getting a 4, 5, 6 drop off your 2 or 1 mana cycling is just way too good. Weaponize the Monsters is a 1 mana uncommon enchantment. For 2 mana you get to sacrifice a creature. Weaponize the Monsters deals 2 damage to any target. I know people are looking at this in their Rakdos sacrifice decks, but the fact that this is an uncommon makes it really rough on that deck. It's also not really the kind of deck that has a bunch of fodder lying around. So getting this sacrifice engine going in that and keeping it up is going to be really rough. In other decks that have a more free recursion, I do see this happening, but you have to keep into account that this card is a blank in multiples, so it will most likely be played at most twice. And the deck won't be able to rely heavily on that ability. So I do expect to see it. I just don't know how good it will actually be. Yidaro, a Wandering Monster, is a 7 mana rare trample haste 8/8. It has cycling 4, and when you cycle it, shuffle it into your library from your graveyard. If you've cycled a card named Yidaro 4 or more times, put it onto the battlefield from your graveyard instead. Do this before you draw. In Gentry, you're only allowed to play one, which makes this really fun design pretty near unplayable in Gentry. It's something that will only happen if you get ridiculously lucky. Don't go for it. That wraps up the red cards. Most important thing we've seen here is a bunch of support for big red and double strike decks that might spur new decks. I'm excited to try that big red deck and see what I can make of it, but there's so many ideas that are fighting each other there that I think it's going to be really hard. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and check out the other videos in this set review.